Okay, hello, welcome everybody to this next event in the Pontoon Virtual Symposium. We're very, very pleased to have Professor Gilly Salmon with us to do a talk. I'm going to introduce her a little bit, tell you a little bit about her in a moment. But before that, I just wanted to give you a sense of the structure for the event, which is, so Gilly's going to talk for about half an hour, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. You can either type them and put them in the chat box, or you can come in and speak them to her, and then we'll wrap up about sort of 1:45, if that's okay. So Professor Gilly Salmon has been a learning innovator for more than 30 years, and she's one of the world's leading thinkers in digital and blended learning. So she's pretty much the perfect guest we could get for a symposium like this. She researches and publishes widely on the themes of innovation and change in higher education, and on the exploitation of new technologies of all kinds in the service of learning. She's internationally renowned for her significant contributions to education futures, including research, innovation, program design, teaching methods, and the use of new technologies. So thank you, Gilly, and take it away.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you very much for asking me. I love talking about these subjects, and I hope you'll all be interested and ask me lots of really difficult questions. Of course, nobody really knows what the future is going to do, but I hope, like me, you feel, well, let's have a go and create it the way we want it to be, rather than stand by and just let it happen to us. So what I'm going to try and do is give you some signposts that you may be able to adopt and explore. Thank you very much for that introduction, Tom. My mother would have believed all of that. Just to let you know that, like many of those of you involved in the project, I was definitely not born with a silver spoon. I was first in family to go to university, and indeed pretty late after I'd got married and produced some children. And my youngest child was actually 2, and I was over 30 when I started with the Open University, and then went on to do Masters and PhD after that. And I have been a professor for a long time now. So I think it's really head down, hard work, and a bit of luck, and an awful lot of support from people that makes all the difference. So just to let you know, I'm certainly not coming from an elite place to explore all these very important areas that somehow have become even more important in this rather unusual year. So I'm going to share screen now. Just a great acknowledgement of this lovely project and all the sponsors of it as well, which you will see here. And then I'm going to go on to my talk, which is really looking ahead about 5 years, because I think if we are going to create the future, we need to have an idea of what we're creating for. I think what I'm going to explore is ways that you can perhaps create your own pathways and make good choices. And the way this is usually, I read up on this a fair bit before this talk, and I found that all the reports are talking about how many jobs and skills are going to be lost because of the major changes that are occurring in what's called 4.0. The jobs that might be gained, because it's not all losses, and the jobs that might change, and the winners and losers in that. But I think as a result of pandemic as well, we've also seen a lot of people who in the emergency situation, rather than stand back and wait for their jobs to be resolved, have been able to transfer skills to other situations. So I'd add a fourth to that. And so I think whenever we think about it, we need to think about, well, what's going to continue, what's going to disappear, and truly what's absolutely new that we need to take on. So this is what my talk's about. You need to really have a good sniff around, I think, and start to think, well, what's meaningful for me? What's meaningful for the people that I'm trying to enable? And how can we evolve to make it more likely that this pathway is the one that we'll continue to follow? And I'm going to use, because of the creative nature of Pontoon Project, I'm going to use some illustrations. So I'll briefly explain this to you. It's really trying to imagine you're looking out of a window to 2026 and you're trying to do what we're all going to have to do in the future and make sense of truly what's out there and what's coming towards us so that we can be part of that rather than staying inside as we're having to do at the moment and just look out on the changing world. And just to make it a little bit easier, I've also put some words on, some labeling to my landscape. And I've also, as you can see, I've divided it up into 4 quadrants. So I'm actually going to go on and talk about each of those quadrants. So I work mainly in the university sector. So what's down the bottom left-hand corner is the "we shall not be moved" physical campuses. And that was what inspired me to call this, what if actually in the future, those beautiful buildings, some of which certainly in the UK and also in France as well, have been there for centuries, what if actually they're going to become redundant? And what if the legacy of the way we taught because of those places is going to change? How can we make best use of that area? And then up the top left, they're areas that where how can we outreach in all sorts of ways? How can we reach out to the new generation who are definitely see online as the place to be? How can we look at globalization that is quite different from the kind of physical moving about of mobility that we've had before? Bottom right, this is where our world has been changed as a result of many consumer technologies, not the least our mobile and smartphones, but also a whole array of other things that as educators we would not have been able to afford to develop, have been developed as consumer technologies. Our responsibility is to adapt these, subvert them, if you like, for learning purposes, and what that might mean for the future. And then, of course, the unknown depths and the mountains and opportunity, treasures and dragons and goodness knows what in the 4th quadrant. So I'm hoping you'll get the kind of idea of where I'm going with this illustration. If we have anyone with us who absolutely must have a diagram, this is what I've just said, but not in pictorial form. So what we've got at the present, what might be the future, but will require quite different organizational transformation. Number 3 is kind of using what we're really good at, that's called resource-based strategy, but harnessing the new technological opportunities, and then out there for research and prototyping, potential emergent learning, new types of learners, new missions, new markets. And surprisingly, that's one of the really good things that's come out of this horrible pandemic, that it's given us a big push towards trying to imagine different futures. There's not any evidence so far that anyone's going to go back onto how it was before. So it's all to play for. So I hope you're all with me. Please feel free to put anything in the chat that you disagree with or you'd want to question as I go through. So I'm going to tackle each one of these in a little bit more detail now. So here we have the complete legacy buildings, and there are hundreds of them and they're very expensive. So they're not going to disappear. So we do need to think about maximizing the use of them. And maybe they could be like a port, a brand, a place to be around which we build our learning, possibly. And if we do that, why don't we outreach to those people who probably would never have gone to that kind of place of learning, or may have been reluctant to at least? And why don't we think about other ways of doing it? So what about now nearly half the whole world has a smartphone, 2/3 has a mobile phone, and at least half the world's traffic now comes through mobile devices. So what if your learning was always in your pocket, not just content, but your whole interaction, your whole way of learning? And I think there are all sorts of ways in which we could use the mobility that almost everyone carries, so that your learning was constantly with you. So a new meaning, if you like, of lifelong, minute by minute, daily. Most people think that they need to get us off of our screens. How about if it was really giving us the learning we needed for the new world that we're entering? There are lots of ways in which you can use mobility and authenticity for learning, besides the obvious ones of communication. There's lots of tools and resources. Um, what about outside learning? I mean, where are all the schools that have moved to the outside, cold weather or not? I'm lucky that I live in Epping Forest, so it's possible to go for fantastic walks, and a whole school is around us. And so it's not just lifestyle and convenience, it's also authenticity. So think about that. I'd like to show you another example now, and I've put the web reference here of something I've been working on. There's a massive, massive logjam in the healthcare sector, everything from medics to nurses, to the whole of the allied health professions, people like physios and the rest. And of course, we're needing to, there's about 36,000 shortage at the moment of nurses in the UK alone. And they all have placements or internships, clinical placements to learn. And during this year, most of those have ceased or been dramatically reduced. So we've put a huge amount of the learning online, not with fancy technology, just using the university's virtual learning environments. And we're offering at least partial placements online, working with the clinical providers, working with the university. So any of you are interested in that, I think that's a fantastic example where you can achieve great outcomes, and use an alternative. So I'm going to move on now to number 2. Do you remember that was taking the university place as a port from which the journey occurred, and out there for, I sort of think about it, the what about us? Everybody that was not going to go to campus, or was going to find it too expensive, or not relevant or authentic or meaningful enough for them. And that's where the equivalence of online learning becomes so incredibly important. I've put a link there to a blog that I wrote in the midst of the pandemic, trying to convince people that there is super amount of scientific evidence that well-structured, well-developed, really good online learning is not only just as good as going to a place, but actually may even, shock horror, be better. You need to read the evidence for yourself on that. And what have the student experienced during this year? So much of the anxiety has been about taking people to campus, and the loss of Freshers Week and all the queuing and all the anxiety. And now we're seeing people have to be tested before they can go home again. And then the campus started to adapt. So there's social distancing and bubbles and more outdoor and all the sanitizing that we've all experienced. But with entirely digital, you have absolutely full access. True, you must develop more flexibility and resilience. So in the event that your college does turn into a data center, you must expect very high quality online learning, but it doesn't mean to say it's not just as good. And so there's, students have been expecting to go to a place to do their learning for, certainly in the UK, for around 1,000 years now. So obviously it's a dagger to the heart to say, hey, do it differently. We do instead need to take people with us and truly understand this. Hope you're all still with me. Nobody's gone off in horror. Okay, number 3. Do you remember this was the one where out there in the commercial world, they're developing an incredible number of things that we can use for learning. We're never going to be able to develop virtual reality, except for the very, very few. But we need to adopt and adapt and transfer and for ourselves as educators to develop the best ways of using those. And obviously it's a way of people repeating opportunities. It's a way of doing something that you could never do. We've been working, for example, with paramedics, so that scenarios can be repeated many times. In the virtual placements, you can have virtual placements. Nobody dies, no matter how bad the treatment. So we can make mistakes, which we know is a key part of learning. And we can view things that we'd never normally have access to. So I think there's a fantastic area where the adaptation needs to occur. But you can't simply thrust that technology on anyone. It needs small-scale research and prototyping. Another area that I'm extremely keen on is humanoid robots. This was how I learned to program for the first time in my life. Simply to program the Now robot at home, taking my time, working it out, and then Bluetoothing it to the robot when I went into the university the next morning. And wow, it walked around and talked, more or less. So we have a huge responsibility to find easy ways of doing this. And I just find the humanoid robots are so much more acceptable to everybody else, kids and adults alike. So be bold and have a go at that. Another area I like, I'm quite keen on the fashion industry. Do have a look at the amazing future for wearables, not only fabric, and not only for sports science and the like, but also for fashion, and the whole issue of responsive fabrics. Very, very interesting. How can you use that for learning? Well, it means you've got constant monitoring, you've got constant approaches, and it's really a very different way of engaging. So beyond the fitness trackers and into really the idea of humans interacting with the technology environment differently. And of course, artificial intelligence. There's a nice book out recently, if you're interested in this, from Donald Clark, who really addresses the issue of artificial intelligence for learning. And it can be fantastic to try small scale projects in this area, and particularly links if you're moving to more online or blended learning, because you've got a 24/7 responsive area for students to ask questions, better than getting emails every day. So last but not least, I want to talk about quadrant 4, which is what's coming over the horizon. What's coming over the horizon for technology, what's coming over the horizon for education. And that is up to every one of you. So the pathway I'm going to offer you for this is to look back and try and learn from the past. So I've put an article there that I wrote last year, which is called May the 4th Be With You. It's quite long, it's about 10,000 words, but it's in a lovely journal that's completely open source. So I hope you'll have a look at it. And it talks about how the industrial area goes back a long time, and then how education has gradually, usually there's been a lag, kept pace with that. And so here comes a prediction. Fortunately, I'm at the point in my career where it's okay to be wrong. That actually Education 4.0 is going to be accelerated by the experience of 2020, and that should make it much better and easier for us to get ready for the Industrial Revolution 4.0, Health 4.0, Globalization 4.0, maybe Society 4.0 is what we're talking about. So, a quick one this, but what do I think are the most important areas for these? So, what I'm trying to do myself and find out from all the predictions of the skills that are needed, absolutely focusing on design. Now, many of you work in the creative arts and you're used to the ideas of design, but actually it needs to transfer to every aspect of our life. So we're now seeing teaching as a design science, for example. Learning, we need to design our learning. Problem solving, really, the skills of problem solving, which were at one time considered specialists to engineers, for example, really need to apply to every topic and every job now. That's what's going to be important. Some of these interesting areas of influencing and empathy are coming more and more to the fore. They've always been considered perhaps a female trait, but perhaps they're now considered a human trait. They're going to be important. And of course, adaptability, adaptability, adaptability. So any learning I'm doing at the moment, any development I'm doing, I'm making sure I've got one or more of those in. So that's a little bit of my prediction for me of what's important. So that's what's come out of my 4. So I've got down the bottom here the fact that we've got a huge legacy of place-based learning, and we need to exploit that for better quality, more appropriate ways of educating for the future without expecting everyone to come to us on a full-time basis in order to do that. Outreach for online learning to meet a whole range of ways. And really, it needs to be fully digital learning wherever appropriate. And the learning outcomes need to be equivalent to any others, because that's one of the ways of dramatically reducing discrimination. And then, you know, to use the everyday things that we're getting used to, all the smart technologies around us, and exploit them for learning purposes. And finally, take a few risks. What's coming over the horizon? Do small scale projects and take risks, because that's the way that creativity will develop. And that's the way we'll prototype the future and steer it towards our preferred and viable ways. So I'll go back to the beginning, and I'd like your views on this. What actually is going to continue? Not a lot, I suspect. I'd be very welcome to have your views. Are there some things that are truly going to disappear? We're certainly seeing the most extraordinary occurrence of some very big monolithic retail areas disappearing around us. Quite shocking, actually. Couldn't believe it when Laura Ashley went. But also what's new, and also from the point of view of your skills, what can you transfer to what's going to continue? What are you going to transfer to what's new? And also, what are you going to let go? That's the hardest part of all, to make space for the new. So I'm going to stop there, and I've allowed 15 minutes where we can discuss this. You can ask me questions, expressions of disbelief or horror, if you like. So that's my questions to you. What if your university is going to become a data center? So over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Gilly, first of all, for a very interesting presentation. I think you know, it feels like you're really addressing very timely, very kind of modern questions, to do with learning, to do with universities. And this is, personally, this resonates with me as the other side of my role at the university is I'm a lecturer in creative writing. And I suppose the thing I was going to ask about actually was sort of when you're talking about equivalence, which I think is, really important concept, and about the sorts of outcomes that we should be expecting from these kind of digital learning methods and so on. And I suppose one of the challenges for me and my colleagues, and I guess other lecturers all over the world might be kind of feeling this particular burn, is sort of how certain. I mean, I teach creative writing, and while I'd rather be in the classroom doing that, it's doable over Zoom and it's doable over these digital platforms. But I feel sorry for colleagues who are teaching like engineering or very practical, tactile sort of subjects. And I guess there are challenges with trying to replicate what people would do in practical workshops where you've got to be in the room and you've got to show a student how to do something with nuts and bolts or their hands. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about how those sorts of challenges for teaching those sorts of subjects or skills might be overcome with the sort of technologies that we've got. Are there new technologies that, I don't know, I wonder with virtual reality whether you can replicate being in a a garage or something with car mechanics, and therefore that might be a way of simulating what it's like to actually physically fix something or build something.
Okay, I understand the problem. I just don't accept that some subjects cannot be done this way. So the answer I would suggest is this, that what you need to understand is the threshold concepts of the pivot to doing it face-to-face to online. And that involves various things. One is that you must design the pedagogical pathways. If you I mean, the emergency teaching that, as you're right, thousands, millions possibly of learners and teachers have been doing across all levels of education across the world this year, that is emulating what happens face to face. We've got to make the next jump now to really meeting the quality. So you start with the learning outcomes. You always start with the end in mind. But then you need to work back to designing something that may not look quite the same. So you're not trying to replicate the way you always did it, but actually rethinking the way it's possible to do it. And that does need more scaffolding, both in terms of the content and of people working together. It does not need a load of fancy technologies. In fact, the more invisible the technology is, the better. And most universities, at least, have got fairly good virtual learning environments. Okay, I know faculty don't always like them, but they're safe, they're secure, they're supported, they're invested, and there's not so many of them to learn now. So no, the answer is not to go out and use all the fancy stuff. With the PEEP, which was the virtual placements one I showed you, we've insisted that everyone's used their regular university virtual environment. Blackboard is fine, so is Moodle, so is Canvas, all that stuff. It's okay. But then the actual design is that there's a lot of structure. It's very purposeful. Learners know what they're doing every time. There's alignment between all the online activities across a whole variety of different areas. So if you're interested in that one, and I've put the reference in there and you can have a look at it. But I do hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, it's all very well, but you can't do it for this or that. Whereas you'll find on our website, if anyone's interested in how to do this for engineering, this structure for engineering, there's a great video where we interviewed a guy called Professor John Fothergill, who's an electrical engineer. And he talked about how he had on-campus students and entirely online students doing the same course over a long period of time. Shock horror, he got better outcomes from the online side of things. He said himself, I love the lab work. I love the lab work. I love doing it, but it isn't the only way. And and he also talked about how he had to structure it differently, how he had to get his head around thinking it differently. So there's a nice little video on there. I've probably put the Alchemist website somewhere, so if not, I'll put it in the chat in a minute. So yes, it can be done. It can be done. It just needs this change in design thinking to understand how to get people engaged in the subject with the learning outcomes as your absolute purposeful goal, rather than saying, oh, well, it's all right for some and not for others. Just don't believe it.
Good, that's good. I think that give a lot of people hope. And I think it probably accords with a lot of what we've learned on Pontoon in terms of having to really, adapt our approaches to teaching and upskilling, according to the sorts of challenges that, facing our beneficiaries and the people that we've taught. So that's great. Does anyone else have a question for?
Tom, there's one in the chat,
oh, great.
which is about someone looking at accelerating creative leadership across the employment sector, so problem solving. I think the thing to do with this is to see problem solving as a pedagogical process. So there are people, I mean, who know how to, think about problem solving in a whole variety of ways. And the idea of creative problem solving applies to almost anything. So you just need to know how to structure it in the online environment. And it can be, if you structure it well, work extremely well in asynchronous environments. So the one thing for that is that I've been researching small pieces of interactive work, which are called e-tivities. They've been very well researched, particularly in the area of leadership development, both across distributed companies and across, management students, MBAs. And they were originally developed for remote MBA students in the Open University. So I'll put that in the chat as well, because that may be very helpful for you to get started in that area. So while you see if there's any more questions, if you look on my website, there is an activities section, so I'll put that in. I'll just put our YouTube channel in as well. While you're thinking about any more questions. I've got the YouTube channel. Yeah, here we are. It's the one where we're talking to Professor John Fothergill. That was the one that you'll be interested in terms of engineering online. And he has got a bit of a summary. There's one, I don't know whether it's in there or whether it's in another presentation, but there is definitely a reference to 10 years of comparative work where he succeeded with online students. He also did it because he became a Pro Vice Chancellor, but still wanted to be able to carry on teaching his course. I mean, the only thing about where you change to teaching online is that you have got to do this design up front. Whereas I think when you're used to teaching time by time on campus, it's a more incremental development of your course over time, and you're more responsive to the group. You've got that time. Whereas if you move to online, you've got to do it all in advance, really. But then the advantage of that is you design once, you can deliver it many times, and you can diary for the times you need to make the intervention and make small changes as you go through. So I think you'll find that helpful. Hope so.
I just wondered if there's obviously this kind of move, this very fast move to whole kind of areas of learning being online and virtual and so on is sort of requires an infrastructure, the right kind of infrastructure, doesn't it? And investment and funding and so on. And I suppose I'm aware there's sort of issues that have come up recently about there being a kind of inequality in terms of around Britain, for example, in terms of people's access to internet, speedy internet and so on. What sort of challenges do you think need to be kind of addressed infrastructurally in order to be able to support this kind of new landscape of
Okay.
of
Well, in terms of the infrastructure, I think obviously if you're trying to do most of the way through synchronous learning, we know that some students find it difficult either because of bandwidth or because simply the home environment is not suitable for a whole variety of reasons. It was particularly powerful during the time when everyone was trying to work at home and the children weren't at school. I had a great time because I ran what became known as nanny school online for my grandchildren. Had a super time, you know, teaching a little one to read and teaching an 8-year-old the periodic table. But I probably enjoyed it more than they did. But I had a great time, which helped their parents out a little bit. But actually, if you use mainly asynchronous learning, it's much more flexible. You still need structure, but don't try and get everybody together at the same time. And so the sort of thing you want there is the 5-stage model. Again, I'll just put my general website up. You'll see if you look at the 5-stage model and the activities, there's a whole load of advice for you. And activities work best with only a little bit of synchronous stuff in it, mainly using the bulletin board, using e-portfolios. You've already got those in your VLE and they will work with low bandwidth and they'll work on mobile phones and so on. So I think you have to address it that way. I mean, I was on a panel this morning where we were actually talking about a whole range of universities in New Zealand where there was quite serious problems during lockdown, and they simply sent out mobile devices out to sort of Indigenous students and so on, and found that they were very happy to engage in that way. One, use what they've got anyway and design accordingly. I don't think we can tackle improving the infrastructure, although hopefully it will improve gradually. And two, recognise that learning, if you're not in a place, there'll be a whole variety of distractions. So design for small, very purposeful, very clear deadlines, very structured all the way through, very scaffolded. Did I answer what you asked me, Tom? You still got your mute on.
I'll mute myself as well. Yeah, no, it does absolutely, and also just made me think of yet more connections
Okay,
between
keep
what
going.
Pontoon's been doing as well. So
Yeah, so there's a few links here. The Education Alchemist one, particularly if you look at the placements, there's quite a lot there. My website, which has got all my academic work on, the YouTube channel is there. But also the article on which the 4 quadrants is based, I've also put a link to that. Again, it's an open source journal, so everyone can have a look at that, which is really the way skills are moving. But I've explored quite a lot about how the mode of learning has to change, not only the outcomes of it. And for anyone who just wants it, I put a load more references at the end as well.
excellent.
But please feel free to let people have these slides if they want them, Tom, because they can have a bit of an explore.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. I'm thinking that these would be really useful for the work I'm doing on knowledge transfer, and I'd love to read your article and quote.
Yeah, sure. Well,
Yeah.
they're all open. They're all open. I've stopped writing books and I only publish in open source journals now because I think that's the way to create the future together, and I do believe that. So I'll send you an update of these slides. I think you had just a slightly earlier version of them.
Should we just take a last question, because we're sort of almost
Sure.
our time's almost up. We've got a couple of minutes, but there's one here. Can this approach be used for community learning outside of the academic framework? We've talked about universities and kind of formal education, but I'm almost certain that these sort of technologies can be used in almost any context.
Yes, it's what I know best is university level education. But the key thing to look out for this is if you Google it. So if you just Google Gilly, Salmon and the 5-stage model, that's been used extensively for community education and also the activities work as well. But you do need to make sure that you've got a good environment, a safe environment for people to work in, especially if they're younger people. So it has been used extensively. I developed it for university education, but then it was really crowdsourced and adopted for a whole range of other things. So absolutely, yes. And if you want to, whoever the questioner was there, if you want to email me,
Vivian, yeah.
If you want to email me after today, I'm happy to discuss it some more. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think that would be a good place to stop. Thank you again, Gilly, for a really fascinating overview of all kinds of, exciting new approaches to learning. And, I've learned a lot just in this brief period. I'm sure other people here have too. So it'd be great to sort of stay in touch with you as we come to the end of Pontoon and start to sort of do a kind of reckoning of what we've achieved. And because a lot of what you've said, I think, really is very relevant to what we've done.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd like to know more. I'd like to do that.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, we're very honoured for you to found the time. I know this wasn't difficult for you. You had a busy schedule. You had a meeting this morning to do as well. So we're really pleased.
Yeah, there's a big conference going on at the moment that I'm heavily involved in, but it's fine. I'm absolutely happy to talk to you.
Excellent. All right.
Okay. Enjoy the rest of the symposium, everyone. Have
Will
a good
do.
day and create your own futures.
Thank you.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye bye now. Bye.